Hi, this is Liz Schmidt, Communications Chair of the APHA Disability Section. This month on Disability Sections Leading the Way, we have Dr. Anthony Cahill, the Center Evaluation Director and Director of the Division of Disability and Health Policy at the Center for Development and Disability in the University of New Mexico's School of Medicine, affiliated professor of public administration in the University School of Public Administration, and assistant professor of pediatrics in the university's School of Medicine. Dr. Cahill came to the field of disability and disability studies in the mid 1990s after an unexpected and unplanned move from the University of Maine to Albuquerque, New Mexico. Since joining the University of New Mexico in 1997, he has brought his knowledge of methodology, survey design, applied statistical analysis, and evaluation to numerous disability-related projects. He has served the disability section of APHA in many capacities, including section chair, program chair, accessibility co-chair, and governing co-chair for 2 terms. Welcome, Dr. Cahill. First, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about what prompted you to get involved as a leader in the disability section.
Well, I think I need to preface that with how did you learn about the group?
Yeah, absolutely.
Somebody recruit you, because that came before deciding to join the leadership. And I got involved with the disability section kind of out of sheer fate. My field was not disability. I had nothing to do with disability. I was, public policy, but my research was in the impact of technology in state and local governments. And in 1996, my closest companion in the world, my closest colleague in the world, and the father of my 4 godchildren dropped dead. And Sam Overman, and I was the department head, or I was the head of public administration graduate programs for the University of Maine system. And about 4 months after he died, I resigned my job. I loaded everything I owned into a big U-Haul, strapped the car on the back, and drove from Augusta, Maine to Albuquerque to help raise my 4 godkids with their mother, Barb. And among many other things, I didn't have a job. So I was doing some consulting, and the then head of our USED, of our center, kind of heard I was in town and called me, and we had a meeting, and she looked at me and said, "Do you know anything about outcomes?" And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I do, quite a bit." And she gave me a consulting contract to work with various programs in the center to shift to impact-based evaluations, which they were not doing at the time. And I don't know, maybe 6 months, 9 months after that, it was worked out well. And she literally kind of stood in my office door and said, "Well, why don't you just work here?" And I said, "Okay."
That'd be great.
But now I was working at the Center for Development and Disability, and I didn't know anything about disability really. But I did know about research and evaluation and data and statistics, and so that worked out well. But I began, obviously, to start to get drawn into disability-related issues. And as things have a way of happening, I was sitting in my office one day, and a guy came to my door. It's this really tall, really skinny guy with a ponytail and a cowboy hat. And he said, "I'm from the health department, and we're going to write a big grant to the CDC for a state disability and health program. Are you interested?" And I said, "Sure." So we ended up being one of the disability and health grantee states.
Wow.
And we were for about 14 years, I guess. And at that point, the disability and health states were a bigger part of the disability SPIG than they are now. It was a much smaller group. So somebody said, well, you need to go to the American Public Health Association. That's kind of where all this is happening. I'd never heard of it before. My relevant cognizant professional groups were the Association of Public Policy and Management, and those kind of groups. So I think the first one I went to was in Washington, and that's how I heard about it. And I didn't really know anybody. At that point, the generation beyond me was the leadership, and it included Don Lawler, and Glenn White, and some of the others. And I was not a graduate student. I was in my mid-40s, but I was a total newbie. And I think what struck me, and this kind of gets to one of the other questions, the section was much smaller. Oh, it wasn't a section, it was this big. And I have to say it was very incestuous. So there'd be 40 of us sitting in the room, and 3 or 4 of us would get up, go up to the front of the room, give a presentation, we'd all applaud. They'd come and sit down. Another 3 or 4 of us would go up. Literally, that's what they weren't bad. And I very much felt an outsider, because clearly everybody knew everybody. And I didn't at that point. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, my first APHA, I didn't really do anything except go, isn't this interesting? But because of my job, I ended up starting to get involved in disability-related issues. And, it's now 20 some odd years, and clearly disability is now my field. And we started doing a lot of grant work in disability. And, as these things so often happen, so much of it is chance. Mm-hmm. The flying fickle finger of fate, just like the way I ended up at the Center for Development and Disability. It was my best friend in the world had a heart attack. And that was a very tragic thing, but David coming to my door, and I have no idea who he is, and I just said, sure, I'll be happy to work on your grant with you. Right. So another meeting, another chance encounter that I had, and it was at the Disability and Health State Grantee meeting, not APHA, but the CDC at that point was very chintzy, and there was not even a cup of coffee to be had. And I was really grumpy. And so I kind of got down to the meeting and then left again to go find a Starbucks or a coffee shop of some sort. And I ran into this guy who I had seen at the meeting. I had no idea. And he was equally grumpy about the coffee. Well, and it turned out to be Joe Canoes, who for about 15 years was the vice president of the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation.
Oh, okay.
And we started chatting, and he said, oh, you're a researcher, and we've got a couple of things I need your advice on. If I flew you into New Jersey, could you spend a few days with us? And I said, yes. Well, that led to me being the research and evaluation director for the foundation for about 12 years.
Wow.
I mean, not that we didn't do good work, but it wasn't a competitive grant. It wasn't, it was just something that we walked into. In terms of the leadership, what prompted me to get involved as a leader? Well, one of the things that has not changed about the disability section is we don't do a great job of identifying, recruiting, and mentoring future leaders. I actually think we're doing a much better job now, including people, with people like you. Meg is really good at that. And it's something we should have done, but didn't. Well, the generation before me didn't do it either.
Right.
And at that point, I was running something called the Southwest Conference on Disability, which we had out here for about 12 or 13 years. And we had about 1,000, 1,200 people from across the country. But 60, 70% of the people were people with various physical and cognitive disabilities. So accessibility became a huge issue. And I didn't have to be an expert in disability to understand issues of accessibility.
Right.
And at that point, like now, the then SPIG was having a terrible time with APHA in terms of its attention to accessibility. Um, they were putting the disability sessions in different rooms. Sometimes it was one session was in the convention center and the next session would be in a hotel. The issues have changed. The theme hasn't.
Right.
APHA does not have a sufficient grasp on all accessibility, however you define it.
Right.
And there was a young woman, Catherine Graham, from North Carolina, who was going to be the accessibility chair. And she came to me and said, I just can't do this by myself. I have a job. Would you be the accessibility co-chair? Because of your work on the, you don't have a disability, but because of your work on the Southwest Conference, you know a lot about it. And I said, yeah. And we did that together for about 4 years, I think. Okay. And, one of the questions is about, some of the challenges. I'm skipping questions a little bit, but that's okay. Me. We put a huge push on making the conferences accessible. We didn't quite do it the way y'all are doing it now, but we tried to work with APHA proper to get disability into the planning process for the conferences, and it worked up to a point. One of the things they used to do, for example, was sign language interpreters were assigned only to disability section sessions. So apparently, if you were a deaf epidemiologist, you didn't need an interpreter because you weren't going to the disability sections, only the epi ones. So we were able to change that up, Catherine and I, and lots of others.
That's a huge accomplishment.
It was actually at the time. I mean, it sounds trivial now because it sounds like you used to do what? No. And but it was a big accomplishment at the time.
Yeah.
We did get them to take into account. I mean, for years we tried to get them to require their film submissions to be captioned, and we never had much success in that. One of the things we worked hard on, though, was physical accessibility of the convention centers to which we went. And we got them to agree to include us on the planning committee, the internal APHA planning committee. And we also got them.
And that in itself is another big accomplishment.
It was. It was. Now, how much influence we had is open to question. But if you don't have a seat at the table.
Right, exactly.
You can't even try. So we got them to agree to include one of us, and we didn't know which one, to be part of the advance team that would go to the convention center before the contract was signed. And I forget which city we were going to be in. And we had dates in mind and so on. And we didn't hear from them. And then we had another call of the success, the planning committee. And one of us asked about, well, what about this site visit? And they said, oh, we did that last month. They just flat out blew us off.
Oh my gosh.
Whether it was deliberate or not, I don't know. I suspect it was, because how do you forget a commitment you made,
Yeah, right?
So it was challenging. Those were some of the challenges. We're still having fights over the height of the booths in the exhibit table.
Right.
That has been solved so many times, and it always seems to get unsolved. We had a commitment that they did follow through on to lower the height, so we weren't using big stools. And they did do it for a while, and all of a sudden they just disappeared. And then when they were going to redo the APHA section of the exhibit hall. And we got a commitment from them that in the redesign, the physical redesign, they would lower everything. Well, they lowered the disability sections and not anybody else's.
Oh gosh.
Then then Carl Cooper, when he was working on it, got a commitment for them to redo it. And all of a sudden, was it 2-3 years ago, I went down to the exhibit hall, and the low disability section exhibitor table had been replaced with the tall one. And at this point, I was a sufficient old fart that I just went and found James Carbo, the APHA chief of staff, who's a nice guy. And I said, Jim, come on,
Right.
and he was mortified. So the problem, I think, is the battles we're fighting now, we were fighting then.
Yeah. A lot of these do sound familiar.
I think we did make we had some successes, but it's kind of telling that we're dealing with many of the same issues. So, 20 years after I joined the APHA, we're still fighting over the height of the disability section booth in the exhibit hall.
Right.
So, and those challenges just have not gone away.
Which is frustrating.
One of the things we were able to do, and then I'll kind of get off this, is every room, and if you go to other sections in APHA, you'll still see this. Most every room is set up with a riser without a ramp and a podium and handheld mics. We did get them to at least give the disability section, the setup we currently use, with no riser, lavalier mics, and so on. Of course, those are expensive.
Right.
So APHA wasn't really happy about it. Frankly, that should be true for every session. We do not need risers for those small sessions, but we've not been able to convince them of that. So, short question, long answer.
No, that's great. And it really did kind of talk a little bit about some of the challenges and accomplishments that you encountered in the area of accessibility. And you've had other leadership roles on the disability section since then, right? Would you mind talking a little bit about some of those and kind of how you ended up getting into different roles? I know you said a lot of things were chance and opportunity, but
well, as most of my experience in leadership positions within the section was, I don't know if it was chance, I don't know if it was opportunity, but it certainly was serendipity. One of the things, and you've experienced this, and we're much better than we were in terms of getting new people into leadership positions or younger people into leadership positions, is we had a real paucity of people who were willing and able to step into leadership positions. And so I think, at some point I was the accessibility co-chair with Catherine for probably 4 years or so. And then they needed a program chair elect. And a lot of people at the section had been to the Southwest Conference on Disability, which I was the principal organizer of. And so they knew I had a lot of experience putting together programs. So I was approached and somebody said, well, would you be willing to be program chair elect, and then you're elect for a year or two, and then you get to be the program chair for a year or two. And I thought, well, sure, that's something I know how to do.
Yeah.
It's not new for me. I don't have to learn anything. And it's a way I can kind of, make a contribution to the SPIG. I think we were still SPIG when I started that. So that's how I became program chair.
Awesome.
And then at that point was probably the worst point of having a lack of younger people coming in. So the next step was, Willie asking me if I would think about being section chair. And I said yes. But the reason I said yes was it can't be anything nearly as hard as being program chair. Program chair is the hardest job in the executive committee. It's not all year round, but the recruiting people and managing that awful legacy confex system, and then doing what they have to do now, which is because they've started cutting the number of oral sessions we have, and what y'all are doing with finding other sections with which to collaborate and coming up with joint things. I mean, it can approach a full-time job.
Right.
It was not as bad when I was program chair, we always got 12 oral sessions. And now we're down to 7, I think?
Yeah.
Something like that.
That's nice.
So, 12 oral sessions, and we weren't a lot smaller than we are now, was great. But it was such a job, I thought, section chair can't be any harder than being program chair. And, I run a division in the center, 24, 25 employees. I know management. And by this time, I kind of knew everybody.
Yeah. So it'd be a good fit, good transition.
Yeah, and it was the Gloria Cron and Charles Drum had just stepped down as active leaders, and they'd been put on the governing council, which is where we tend to get our governing councils from. Finished being chair or program chair or whatever. So I was still working with them, but they were kind of on their way out. But it was cool, but I still had access to them. And Roberta Carlin of the American Association on Health and Disability, whom you may not know, but she was very active in the section. Carl Cooper works for AHD.
Okay.
So Roberta is his boss. It's a fairly small organization, but it's quite an opinion leader, believe it or not, in disability in Washington. And Roberta and I have worked together for decades now. We just like working with each other, and we're pretty entrepreneurial. And we come up with projects, and if I get a project, I'll subcontract a part to her and vice versa. We worked for Susan Komen for about 6 years.
Wow.
We developed something called Project Accessibility, which was to increase the accessibility of mammography facilities for women with disabilities.
Okay.
So Roberta was very active in the section leadership. So at that point, I was really comfortable. I was operating with a group of my peers, more or less. So, what did I accomplish during being chair? I think we started the process of starting to regularize things a little bit.
Okay.
The SPIG and then the section had been so small. We didn't make as much effort as we should to involve the membership. Certainly we didn't make as much of an effort to involve students as we do now, and we should have. I had a little teeny tiny bit to do with starting to open that up. But I was not the main leader. I was not the hero. It was just during my tenure as chair when we began to realize, that perhaps we're not immortal. Oh darn. And we'd better start identifying people and starting to regularize the budgeting. So everything that's going on now is far beyond where I took it. But I think it was during my time as chair that we began to realize we needed to do this.
And I think, that's one of those things that really requires multiple people to, even if it's small and investments from each person, we need the investment from each person to really make that change. So that's really important.
Well, I really believe I wasn't being cute when I said in my acceptance speech for the Achievement Award, nothing I've done by myself in my career is as good as the average things I've done with other people.
Right.
And I'm not being modest. That's very true. Because I got a huge ego. But huge egos can know enough to understand their limitations and not be worried about them. And everything I've ever done. I mean, up until the time Sam died, probably 90% of everything in my CV was joint with Sam.
Wow.
Articles, books, grants. We consulted together. I mean, collaboration is just not only is a lot better in terms of outcomes, it's just a lot more fun
Oh, absolutely.
when you find the right group of people.
Mhm.
So I think that's what we started to do with the section. And just as I was ending my time as chair, that's when APHA started getting a lot stricter
Mm.
about the number of sessions, and if you
Oh,
don't get your report in by this date, you're going to lose a slot at the annual meeting,
wow.
and all these kind of silly little rules that they put in. But I didn't really have to face the brunt of that
Okay.
because I was just kind of stepping out at that point.
Okay.
So at that point, kind of getting to the end of that story here, um, they asked me to be, Willie said, would you be on the governing council? And being on the GC is kind of weird because you really don't have a lot to do.
So it's
No,
really
no,
different.
I'm serious. I mean, our big thing is, I mean, we are the governing body of APHA,
Mhm.
but it's a very distant governing body. Candidly, most of the decisions are presented to us by the full-time staff. Um, I get the biggest kick out of it because our meetings, and if you've never been to one of the GC meetings, you should spend a couple hours. You'll have a good chuckle. Um, it acts as a parliamentary body. We have a speaker. We have a parliamentarian. We have, Robert's Rules of Order.
Yeah.
Oh my God, you'd think we were the British Parliament. Um,
Very
and
cool.
and most of the time, the GC is relatively quiet. I mean, if APA says it's got a budget deficit and they need to curtail employee benefits by 2%, like I'm going to vote no. I mean, they run the shop. We don't. I mean, we do, but um, once in a while, a fairly controversial policy statement rears its ugly head. Just as I was ending my time as the chair, somebody put in a right to die, assisted suicide, and proposal, and that was a huge deal for us because it totally ignored people with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Mhm.
And we fought like hell, and Charles Drum and Gloria Cron were instrumental in that. And we really kind of did things we don't normally do. We lobbied, we went to the public hearings at the conference. We were able to get some protections in.
That's good.
My very first governing council meeting, there was a proposal. I sat down next to the other GC, and there was this woman right on the other side of me. I forget which section she was from. And I introduced myself, disability section, my first time. She seemed very nice. And then this proposal came up, basically condemning police for the killing of civilians,
Mm.
which, as you know, is a big issue in this country.
Mhm.
And I'd never heard of it before. I mean, I'd never heard of the policy before, the APHA policy. And so the speaker is reading off the endorsements, and one of the endorsements is from the disability section. And the thing about the proposal, it took on a very important issue in a really bad way. I mean, one part of the policy said, well, yeah, we know sometimes civilians kill police, but that's not really the problem. I mean, it was just so biased, and so the speaker read the disability section endorsement, and this woman looked at me, you know, watching my life, go. So it turned out that one of the EC members, whom I won't mention, had taken it upon herself to just unilaterally endorse this policy on behalf of the section. And that was part of the tightening up we did. That's why we went, it was before your time, I think, but I
Mhm.
went through this little rigmarole where we voted a formal policy that, you know, it's the EC that endorses. The GCs can make recommendations.
That
You
makes sense.
know, that came out of that very specific incident.
And I mean, that's a big accomplishment for the section too, because then it ensures that lots of different voices and perspectives are heard from the disability section.
So anyhow, we did that. I was set to step down at the last convention in Philly. I thought, you know what? I've been on the executive committee for over a decade, like 15 years.
Wow.
It's time, you know, in all those different roles,
Hmm.
and it's time for younger people to take over. And then Willie Horner Johnson, who was the running the elections at that point, called me up and said, "Would you do it one more term?" Because we don't have any, at that point, that was really kind of the most acute point where we just, there were a lot of young people interested, but
Mhm.
they weren't seasoned enough yet to
Right,
go
right.
into leadership positions, and that's no bad reflection on them. Um, and you know, I said, all right, I will do it one more time, but that's it. I'll still be a part of APHA. I have no plans to retire right now.
Right.
I'm in one of those great positions. I love what I do. I love going into work when we actually could go into work.
Yes.
You know, it's not really work to me. So, you know, what am I going to do? Become a greeter at Walmart? So I have no plans to retire, but I think it's really time for, um, you know, and this will happen to Meg, I think, and Willie fairly soon, and some of the other senior people. Well, they'll transition, and it's time for people like you to take over.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's cool. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, that's cool. I think I probably outstayed my welcome a little longer than I should have. I mean, not that I was hogging anything, but you know, I think I should have, if we'd been quicker. And we had a big meeting. It was with Willie and Meg and a few other people, and we realized we were up someplace without a paddle, that we didn't have enough young people who could take over
Right.
quite yet. So we said, all right, we're all going to stay on for one more of everything,
Right.
and then we'll, you know, go to the bar, uh, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I've enjoyed my time with the section. You know, it's a good bunch of people, for the most part. I think it's great that I go to the EC meetings and I don't know more people than I do know. I think that's
Very
wonderful.
different than how it started, it sounds like, for you.
Well, because that means that it's changing and it's growing and it's evolving, and it's not quite so much the club anymore.
Right. Hmm.
Um, I have nothing against clubs, but this shouldn't be one.
Right. Hmm.
At this last meeting in Philadelphia, I walked in, I looked around the room, and I kind of went, "Whoa," because I knew probably a third of the people in the room.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, that's good.
Yeah.
Um, you know, it wasn't good when I started off with the section, but it's good now. So where else do you want to go, if any place? I'm looking at the questions.
Um, I mean, you talked a lot about some key players and allies in the field. And I think you sort of gave a little bit of advice about, even if it was not direct advice, but you were talking a bit about how collaboration was key. And I think that's something important for everyone to take note of. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about what advice you have for future disability section leaders, and or maybe touch on you know, how you found the people to collaborate with and what made good collaborations, or kind of any of that type of advice or information that might be helpful.
Yeah. Imagine me giving sage and pithy advice. I th- I don't think we're doing enough on collaborating with other sections yet.
Okay.
I think Catherine is doing some of it with in her role as, you know, working on the program.
Yep.
Um, I think, and I don't have any recipe for this.
Right.
I think we need to search out. So like Adrian Griffin is now chair-elect of, the public health. Well, that's a natural place to go look and see what issues we might collaborate on. I don't mean APHA issues,
Right.
but substantive issues where maybe we have overlapping things, in overlapping interests on which we could work together.
Absolutely.
For 8 years here, I was PI on a grant, 2 grants from HRSA, which the purpose of which was to integrate oral health into primary care practice. It's a clinical grant, and I'm not a clinician. It just happened that it ended up being housed at my center,
Mm-hmm.
and Heidi and I did the evaluation. So for 2 years, we went and gave presentations at the dental section, the oral health section. Nothing ever came of it beyond that. But, there are connections between what we do and other sections. It takes time. It takes time to make those connections, because sometimes they're cold calls. Right now, Adrian is a fantastic ally because she knows all about the disability section, and she works for AUCD. And that's just one example. But I think we need to do more of that. When health equity became a big issue in APHA, Elena Ong, I was the section chair at that point, called me and said, would the disability section be involved in that? And I said, of course, we'd be delighted. And we ended up helping to plan the very first big pre-conference workshop on health equity. We were not major players, but we were at the table. And the section was recognized as being that. So
that's awesome.
It is awesome. We need to do more of that. You need to do more of that. And beyond that, we still need to recruit members.
Yeah, absolutely.
The financial aspects. There's this. I'll talk about it the next EC. There's this effort going on led by APHA to kind of look at the alignment of all what they call components, sections, SPIGs, whatever, caucuses. I have a funny feeling the purpose is to try to shrink the number of sections.
Interesting.
But that's because I'm a cynical curmudgeon type of guy. But they hired some Beltway bandit to do a survey of members. I don't know if you took it. I did, and they polled people who dropped out of APHA.
Oh, okay.
And they asked why they had polled. 78% of them, I think it was, said the expense.
Wow.
Being an APHA is expensive. Not that you don't know what I'm talking about. The membership dues are steep. The conference registration is really steep. And when Heidi Verdeen, my lead researcher, she and I go every year, it's a $5,000 proposition.
Wow. Yeah.
Between airfare, lodging, hotel, per diem, incidental expenses. Maybe it's 4,000, but
right. It's still a big ask.
Yeah, and for younger people starting off, that's a problem.
Right.
So I don't know how much the section can do anything about that, but I think the section leadership needs to try to address that. I don't have any ideas on how to do that. But so that's what I think. And I've enjoyed it. I'm going to continue to enjoy it. But as after not San Francisco, if we go, and I think that's up in the air right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll see. It might. I hope it does. I enjoy being with 12,000 of my closest friends.
Right.
I will enjoy it as a member. So there you go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I mean, I really appreciate all the advice and just kind of giving us a brief history outlook of the history, from your perspective. Is
Well,
there,
yeah, I guess the last thing I will say is don't do what we did.
what do you
No, I'm
mean?
serious. Do something different.
Yeah,
I mean, if there's something we did, any one of us, whether it be Don or Gloria or, Glenn or me, if it still works, great.
right,
But if over time, more and more of those things won't work, not because they weren't good at the time, but because they're now not good,
right. The times are changing.
don't just do what we did. Do something different. Nobody's going to yell at you, and nobody's going to feel upset. And if they do, the hell with them. So there.
I like that. That's good advice. Good advice to end on. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. And we'll talk to you at the next EC meeting, if not before.
Absolutely. Sounds good. Have a good rest of your day.
All right. Peace, love, tie dye.
Bye-bye.